The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of a failing overhead light. Jack Harrington crouched in the shadows of an abandoned outpost on the moon of Lyris 7, the dull hum of his ship still ringing faintly in his ears. His fingers traced the jagged edge of a metallic shard embedded in the console before him, his movements deliberate, his expression grim. A cryptic distress signal had lured him here, a voice distorted by static, yet unmistakable. "Dad, help us." The last two words had echoed in his mind ever since, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. The voice belonged to Emma, his 10-year-old daughter, whose fierce determination often mirrored his own. She had always been the brave one, the one who would have rather faced a storm than cower behind her older brother. But hearing her voice now, strained and frightened, sent a chill coursing through him. Jack's other hand brushed the hilt of his combat knife, its blade etched with years of use. It was all he'd carried with him after abandoning his post as an SAS operative, a legacy of precision and violence forged in Earth's most grueling conflicts. He'd left the wars behind, or so he'd thought. But the past had an uncanny way of clawing back, and now it came with a vengeance. The faint blue glow of the console flickered to life. The distorted recording played again, repeating its haunting plea. "Dad, help us." Jack's jaw tightened as he scanned the files salvaged from the terminal. It was sparse, but enough to ignite his suspicion. A list of coordinates, a timestamp, and a single name, Aiden Jones. Jones. The name conjured memories Jack had tried to bury. The man had been a rising star within the Galactic Empire, a ruthless strategist notorious for his brutal efficiency in quelling resistance. Jones was the kind of man who made examples of those who dared to defy the Empire's rule. But why target his children? Jack's mind raced as he replayed their last moments together. Emma had insisted on braiding her younger brother Liam's hair, much to the boy's embarrassment. He had watched from the doorway, smiling faintly, their laughter a rare reprieve in an otherwise harsh existence. He had thought they'd be safe. He had been wrong. The console beeped softly, snapping Jack out of his reverie. A holographic map unfolded before him, pinpointing a remote system at the edge of Empire-controlled space. Velker 3. The name was unfamiliar, but it was where the distress signal had originated. If his children were still alive, that's where he would find them. If they weren't, no. He couldn't afford that thought. A faint sound prickled at the edges of his awareness. The soft scuff of boots against metal. Jack froze, his instincts kicking in. Years of training had honed him into a predator, and now that predator reawakened. He melted into the shadows, his breathing shallow, his body coiled. A trio of Empire scouts entered the room, their uniforms gleaming under the flickering lights. They moved with the confidence of those who believed they had no equal, their weapons at the ready. Jack watched, his gaze calculating. One of them, a young soldier with a nervous twitch, approached the console, muttering something about corrupted data. The others fanned out, scanning the room. Jack waited, his muscles taut, his grip firm on the knife at his side. When the time came, he moved like a shadow. The first soldier didn't even have time to cry out, Jack's blade slicing through the air with lethal precision. The second spun around, his blaster raised, but Jack was faster, driving his knee into the man's gut before silencing him. The last soldier dropped his weapon and stumbled back, his fear palpable. Please," the man stammered, his hands raised. Jack's voice was cold, a whisper of steel. "Who sent you?" The soldier hesitated, his gaze darting toward the door. Jack pressed the blade against his throat, the message clear. "Jones," the man choked out. "We were sent to secure the area, in case you came back." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The soldier shook his head frantically. "I don't know. They don't tell us everything. Please, I swear." The sound of footsteps in the corridor cut him off. Reinforcements. Jack acted quickly, knocking the soldier unconscious before disappearing into the shadows once more. He slipped through a maintenance hatch, the metallic clang of approaching boots fading behind him. By the time he reached his ship, the adrenaline had dulled, replaced by a simmering rage. The scouts were a warning, a sign that the Empire knew he was coming. But Jack wasn't deterred. He was done running, done hiding. Inside the cockpit, Jack keyed in the coordinates for Velker 3, the ship's engines roaring to life. As the stars stretched into lines, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The weight of his children's absence pressed heavily on him. But so did the promise he'd made long ago, to protect them at all costs. He didn't know what awaited him on Velker 3, but it didn't matter. Jones had made a grave mistake. He had taken from Jack the only thing he had left to lose. Now, Jack would take everything from him. The ship hurtled through hyperspace, a solitary figure against a vast expanse. Jack stared out at the endless void, his reflection in the glass a portrait of resolve. Somewhere out there, his children's voices echoed, waiting to be silenced or answered. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm coming." The atmosphere on Epsilon Prime clung like smoke, heavy with the stench of desperation. Towering buildings of corroded metal leaned over narrow streets, teeming with shadowy figures. This was the kind of place Jack Harrington had spent years avoiding, a pit of criminals, outcasts, and those who lived in the cracks of society. Now, it was his best shot at finding the tools he needed. Jack moved through the crowd like a ghost, the hood of his coat pulled low over his face. He carried himself with purpose, though every nerve was alert. He felt the weight of the stolen coordinates burned into his memory, the knowledge of his children's possible location, giving his every step a grim determination. In the corner of a dingy cantina, Jack found Alex Grant nursing a drink that smelled like engine grease. The former Alliance engineer looked just as Jack remembered, unshaven, wiry, with sharp eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings. Grant had a knack for surviving, though his ingenuity had cost him his career and, some whispered, his soul. "You look terrible," Grant muttered as Jack sat across from him. "Thanks. I need a ship upgrade," Jack replied, his tone curt. "And I don't have time for questions." Grant raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a lopsided grin. "You've got that look, Harrington. The one that says you're about to do something stupid." Jack slid a credit chip across the table, its value enough to silence most objections. Grant eyed it for a moment before pocketing it with a shrug. "Fine, but don't expect miracles. What are we working with?" "Standard stealth class freighter. I need enhanced shielding, cloaking tech, and weapons, enough to get me in and out of Velker 3 alive." Grant's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. "Velker 3? That's Empire territory. What the hell are you chasing, Jack?" Jack hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I'm chasing the people who took my kids." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Grant's expression softened, but he didn't press further. He gestured for Jack to follow him, and together they made their way through the maze of Epsilon Prime's underbelly to an illicit workshop hidden beneath layers of scrap and debris. The workshop was a chaotic symphony of machinery and half-finished projects. Jack watched as Grant began working, his hands moving with practiced precision. The hum of tools filled the air, punctuated by the occasional curse as Grant muttered about the condition of Jack's ship. "Anything else you're not telling me?" Grant asked without looking up. "I'll pay extra if you keep your curiosity to yourself," Jack replied flatly. Grant snorted but said nothing more. Jack's gaze wandered, his thoughts drifting to his children. Emma's laughter, Liam's quiet focus as he tinkered with his toys. Memories that felt like a lifetime ago. He clenched his fists, willing himself to stay in the present. Several hours later, as Grant worked on calibrating the cloaking system, the door to the workshop creaked open. Jack's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but it wasn't an Empire soldier who entered. A tall woman with striking green eyes and a confident stride stepped inside, her leather jacket scuffed from years of wear. Rachel Vega. Jack recognized her instantly, an infamous smuggler whose name carried both fear and respect in the galaxy's darker corners. I heard you're heading to Velker 3, Rachel said, her voice smooth but edged with caution. Jack narrowed his eyes. And you heard wrong. She smirked, leaning against the doorway. Don't bother denying it. Word travels fast here. If you want to get into Empire territory, you'll need someone who knows their patrol routes and back doors. Lucky for you. I'm feeling generous. Jack didn't trust her, but he didn't have the luxury of turning her away. Generous or expensive? Both, she said with a shrug. But if you're going after what I think you are, I'll cut you a deal. You don't seem like the type to waste time. Why help me? Jack asked, his tone measured. Rachel hesitated, her smirk fading. Let's just say I have my reasons. The Empire's made a mess of enough lives. Maybe it's time someone returned the favor. Jack studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. She held his gaze unflinching. Finally, he nodded. Fine, but if you double-cross me, you won't live long enough to regret it. Rachel smirked again, but there was no humor in it. Noted. The uneasy alliance was struck, and before long, Jack's ship was ready. Enhanced shielding, cloaking technology, and an arsenal of weapons had transformed the freighter into something far more lethal. As they prepared to leave, Grant pulled Jack aside. Be careful out there, he said, his voice low. The Empire's not playing games anymore. They're ramping up their operations. I've heard whispers about something big, something worse than anything they've done before. Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I'll handle it. The ship hummed to life as Jack and Rachel strapped in. The stars blurred into streaks as they jumped to hyperspace, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. As they neared Velker 3, Rachel began briefing Jack on what to expect. The Empire's been using the planet as a staging ground for their new soldiers. Enhanced genetics, cybernetic implants, you name it. These aren't your average grunts. If you're not careful, you won't last long. Jack listened, his expression unreadable. They'll die like the rest. Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, she handed him a small device. Holomapper. It'll help you navigate the base once we're in. Just don't get yourself killed before you find what you're looking for. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and Velker 3 loomed before them, a desolate wasteland dotted with Empire installations. Jack's heart pounded as he prepared for the next step. Somewhere on that planet, the answers he sought waited. The descent was tense, the cloaking system shielding them from detection. As the ship touched down in a remote canyon, Jack felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it. The hunt had truly begun. Before stepping out, Rachel turned to him, her expression uncharacteristically serious. You're not the first person to come here looking for revenge. Most don't make it out. Jack's gaze was cold, unwavering. Then I'll be the exception. The hatch opened, and they stepped into the harsh winds of Velker 3. The landscape was unforgiving, much like the mission ahead. Jack adjusted his grip on his weapon, his mind sharp, his resolve unshaken. As they approached the first outpost, Rachel whispered, We don't have much time. Once we're inside, the clock's ticking. Jack nodded, his focus absolute. The Empire had taken everything from him. Now, he would take it all back. The first thing Jack Harrington noticed as he crept through the outer perimeter of the Velker 3 installation was the silence. Not the natural stillness of an empty desert, but an engineered hush, broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery. The Empire's presence here wasn't just strong. It was absolute. Every shadow, every corner seemed to watch, waiting to expose intruders to the omnipresent threat. Jack adjusted the strap of his rifle and glanced at Rachel Vega, who crouched beside him, her sharp green eyes scanning the terrain. The two had made it through the initial security layers, using her knowledge of the patrol schedules, but the real test was ahead. The towering structure of the Empire's facility loomed like a monolith, its surface gleaming under the planet's pale light. This is the easy part, Rachel muttered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Once we're inside, it'll get messy. Jack didn't respond, his focus already locked on the task ahead. His children's faces burned in his mind, every step a reminder of the stakes. He motioned forward, and the two moved as one, their steps silent, their movements fluid. The entrance to the facility was guarded by a pair of sentries clad in black armor, their visors glowing faintly. Jack signaled to Rachel, and within moments, they were in position. A quick strike, his blade slicing through the first guard's throat, while Rachel incapacitated the second with a silenced blaster. The guards collapsed without a sound, their bodies hidden in the shadows. Inside, the air was colder, sterile. The walls were lined with polished metal panels, the kind that seemed to swallow sound. Jack's boots barely made a noise as they pressed forward, following the map Rachel had provided. Each turn, each corner brought them deeper into the heart of the enemy's lair. They reached a control room, its consoles flickering with data streams. Rachel immediately began hacking into the system, her fingers flying over the keys. Jack stood guard, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. The tension in the air was palpable. "Got it," Rachel whispered, her voice tight. "We're close. Your kids were held in Section C-12, just down this corridor." But Jack, her hesitation made him turn. She didn't look up from the console, but her voice was softer now. "There's a lot of movement on the security feeds. They know someone's here." Jack nodded. "Let them come." They moved swiftly, the corridor narrowing as they approached their destination. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened as they reached the entrance to Section C-12. The door hissed open, revealing a sterile room lit by harsh white lights. Jack's heart sank as his gaze fell on the room's contents. Two small chairs sat in the center, their restraints still in place. Scorch marks marred the floor, and the faint smell of burnt ozone lingered in the air. His breath caught as he spotted a small pendant lying on the ground, a trinket Emma had worn since she was a baby. Nearby, a handmade bracelet, one of Liam's creations, lay discarded. He knelt, his hands trembling as he picked up the items. For a moment, the world around him faded, his grief swallowing everything. Memories surged forth, Emma's laughter, Liam's quiet focus. They were gone. "Jack," Rachel's voice pulled him back. She stood by the door, her blaster raised. "We have company." The sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Jack rose, his grief transforming into a cold, unrelenting fury. He handed the pendant and bracelet to Rachel. "Keep those safe." The first wave of Empire soldiers burst into the room, their weapons blazing. Jack moved with precision, his years of training turning him into a force of nature. Every shot he fired found its mark, every movement deliberate. Rachel held her own beside him, her agility and sharpshooting skills complementing his brute efficiency. The firefight was brutal, the Empire's forces relentless. But Jack's fury was unyielding. He fought not just to survive, but to honor the memory of his children. Each enemy that fell was a step closer to justice, a small victory in a war he hadn't chosen but would see to its end. When the last soldier collapsed, the room was eerily quiet once more. Jack's breathing was heavy, his body tense. Rachel glanced at him, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You good?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the doorway. "We're not done yet." They moved deeper into the facility, following the trail of destruction they'd left behind. The path led them to a large chamber filled with rows of stasis pods. Jack froze as he realized what he was looking at. Inside each pod was a soldier, their bodies enhanced with cybernetic implants and genetic modifications. "This is what they've been working on," Rachel murmured, her voice tinged with disgust. "They're building an army." Jack's jaw tightened. The Empire's cruelty knew no bounds. These soldiers weren't just weapons. They were people, stripped of their humanity and turned into tools of oppression. A voice echoed through the chamber, cold and commanding. "Impressive, Harrington. I wondered how long it would take you to get here." Jack turned to see a figure stepping out of the shadows. Commander Aiden Jones. The man's presence was as imposing as Jack remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of absolute control. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he were observing a particularly intriguing game. "Jones," Jack growled, his grip on his weapon tightening. Jones's gaze flicked to the stasis pods, then back to Jack. "You've made quite the mess, but it's all for nothing. Your children were an unfortunate casualty, a necessary message to those who would defy the Empire." Jack's vision blurred with rage. He raised his weapon, but Jones was already moving, retreating into the shadows as the chamber filled with the sound of heavy footsteps. The enhanced soldiers were waking, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Rachel grabbed Jack's arm. "We need to go. Now." Reluctantly, Jack followed her, the sound of pursuit close behind. They weaved through the corridors, the facility shaking as alarms blared. Explosions rocked the walls, the chaos covering their escape. By the time they reached their ship, both were battered and breathless. The engines roared to life as Jack piloted them away from Velker 3, the planet shrinking behind them. Rachel slumped in her seat, her voice weary. "That wasn't just a fight, Jack. That was a declaration of war." Jack didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the stars. In his hands, he held the pendant and bracelet, his grip firm. "It's not over," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "Not until Jones pays for what he's done." The ship disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of the Empire's facility. Jack's war was far from over, and the hunt for vengeance had only just begun. The Iron Dominion hung in the void like a leviathan, its angular silhouette blotting out the distant stars. Jack Harrington stared at it from the cockpit of his ship, the enormity of the task ahead settling on his shoulders. This was the Empire's flagship, a fortress of steel and death. It was here that Commander Aiden Jones waited, shielded by layers of soldiers, technology, and arrogance. Jack's grip on the flight controls tightened. He had come too far to falter now. Beside him, Rachel Vega finished her final system checks. Her face was drawn, the weight of their mission reflected in her sharp green eyes. "This is suicide, you know that," she said quietly, though there was no hesitation in her tone. "Maybe," Jack replied, his voice low and steady. "But I don't care. Jones dies tonight." Rachel nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had seen many men consumed by vengeance, but Jack's was different. It wasn't blind rage. It was calculated, methodical, a slow-burning fire that had driven him through every impossible obstacle. She didn't fully understand why she was still with him, risking her life for his cause, but something in his resolve had made her stay. Maybe it was the way he carried his grief, not as a weakness but as fuel. The ship's cloaking system activated, and the stars around them seemed to ripple. Jack guided them toward the Dominion's underbelly, weaving through patrols and automated defenses with the precision of a predator stalking prey. The Empire's arrogance was its weakness. They didn't expect anyone to dare approach their most guarded vessel. The landing was smooth, their ship settling into a maintenance bay deep within the Dominion. Jack and Rachel moved quickly, exiting the vessel and blending into the shadows. The air inside the flagship was sterile, oppressive, the hum of machinery a constant reminder of the Empire's technological dominance. Jack's senses sharpened, every movement deliberate as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. They encountered their first patrol near an access point to the command deck. Jack acted without hesitation, his blade slicing through the air. Rachel covered him with her blaster, taking down the second guard before an alarm could be raised. They moved the bodies into the shadows and pressed on, their pace unrelenting. The deeper they went, the more resistance they faced. Enhanced soldiers, their bodies augmented with cybernetics, moved with inhuman precision. But Jack's training and Rachel's agility kept them one step ahead. Each encounter was brutal and efficient, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Jack's movements were almost mechanical, his mind focused solely on the goal ahead. They reached the lift to the command deck, its doors gleaming under harsh lights. Rachel hacked into the control panel, her fingers moving quickly despite the sweat beading on her forehead. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Jack turned to face them, his rifle at the ready. "Almost there," Rachel muttered, her voice tense. Jack didn't respond, his focus on the squad of soldiers rounding the corner. He fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. Rachel cursed as the lift doors finally slid open, and they stumbled inside just as reinforcements arrived. The doors closed and the lift ascended, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Rachel leaned against the wall, catching her breath. "You do know there's no turning back after this, right?" Jack's eyes were cold, unyielding. There never was. The lift doors opened to reveal the command deck, an expansive room dominated by a massive viewport overlooking the stars. Standing in the center, flanked by two enhanced soldiers, was Aiden Jones. He turned slowly as they entered, his expression calm, almost amused. "Jack Harrington," Jones said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I was beginning to think you'd never make it." Jack stepped forward, his rifle trained on Jones. "You killed my children." Jones's lips curled into a faint smile. "I did what was necessary. Their death sent a message, one that will resonate across the galaxy. You were a loose end, Harrington, a relic of a dying world." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, the two enhanced soldiers lunged at him. The room erupted into chaos as Jack and Rachel fought to survive. The soldiers were faster, stronger, their cybernetic enhancements giving them an edge, but Jack's training and sheer determination kept him in the fight. Rachel focused on disabling the room's automated defenses, her hands flying across a control panel as sparks rained down around her. Jack engaged the soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat, his blade flashing as he exploited their weaknesses. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated, a testament to years of discipline and experience. One soldier fell, then the other, their bodies collapsing with a heavy thud. Jack turned to Jones, who had watched the fight with a detached interest. The commander clapped slowly, his expression unchanging. "Impressive," Jones said, "but it changes nothing. The Empire's reach is absolute. Your defiance is nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience." Jack closed the distance between them, his blade gleaming. "This isn't about the Empire. This is about you." Jones moved with surprising speed, drawing a sleek, curved blade from his side. The two men clashed, their fight a brutal dance of skill and fury. Jones's strikes were calculated, each one aimed to exploit Jack's weaknesses, but Jack fought with a ferocity born of loss and purpose. Every blow carried the weight of his children's memory, every parry a step closer to vengeance. The fight was relentless, both men pushing themselves to their limits. Jack's blade finally found its mark, slicing through Jones's defenses and driving deep into his chest. The commander staggered, his expression twisting in shock and pain. Jack held him there, his voice low and steady. "This is for Emma. For Liam." He twisted the blade, and Jones collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor. Jack stepped back, his breathing heavy, his hands stained with blood. The room was eerily silent, the weight of his actions settling over him. Rachel approached, her face pale but determined. The ship's self-destruct sequence is primed. "We have to go." Jack nodded, his gaze lingering on Jones's lifeless body. The man who had taken everything from him was dead, but the cost of revenge had left its own scars. They ran through the corridors, the alarms blaring as the Dominion began to tear itself apart. Explosions rocked the ship, the walls shaking as fire consumed the flagship. Jack and Rachel reached their ship just as the final explosion engulfed the command deck. The stars stretched into streaks as they escaped into hyperspace, the Dominion reduced to rubble behind them. Jack sat in silence, the pendant and bracelet clutched tightly in his hand. Rachel watched him, her expression unreadable. "It's over," she said softly. Jack shook his head. "Not yet. The Empire's still out there. And I'm not done." She didn't argue, her gaze turning to the stars. The hunt for vengeance had ended, but the fight for justice was just beginning.